My sister, Clara, sat right across from me, crying into her coffee.
She could barely look me in the eye when she said it.
She told me she was the reason my entire $75,000 college fund was just gone. I just stared at her, completely frozen. The cafe was buzzing with people laughing and espresso machines hissing in the background. But honestly, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Clara was shaking so hard she looked like she might fall apart. She explained how she found the account details in our dad's home office. She guessed the security questions and slowly drained it to pay off a massive gambling debt. I felt physically sick to my stomach. That money wasn't just some number on a screen to me. It was the inheritance my grandfather set aside in a trust, meant to unlock when I turned 22. It was supposed to pay for my master's degree in architecture. I've been working toward that dream since I was a teenager. And now, because of her reckless choices, it was just gone. To understand why this hurts so much, you gotta know our family dynamic. We were a family totally defined by labels. I was the golden child, the responsible one who always got straight A's. Clara was the exact opposite. She was the family screw-up, the wild card. She dropped out of 3 different colleges and constantly needed someone to bail her out of trouble. And then there was our dad, Richard. To the outside world, he was this highly successful real estate CEO and a pillar of the community. The man was completely obsessed with his public image. He measured a person's worth entirely by their bank account and reputation. His approval was the only currency that mattered to us. He made it clear I was wealthy in his eyes, while Clara was totally bankrupt. When Clara finally finished her confession, I didn't yell. I didn't throw my coffee at her or cause a scene. I just stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked out. I felt completely hollowed out. Later that night, my dad came over to my place. He played the comforting patriarch perfectly, wrapping me in this tight hug. His expensive cologne completely filled the room. He told me how incredibly sorry he was, and how devastated he felt that Clara had sunk so low. He even offered to co-sign some student loans for me. But a few days later, things got weird. I told him I needed to file a police report for the bank, and he immediately tensed up and started pacing. He begged me to handle it internally. He kept saying that bringing the cops into this would ruin our family name and humiliate us in front of the whole community. I get his obsession with our reputation, but we're talking about 75 grand here. I wasn't going to just eat a life-altering financial blow to save Clara from the consequences. So, despite his warnings, I went straight to the bank. Since I just turned 22, I had the legal right to request the complete transaction history for the trust. I sat in the branch manager's freezing cold office while he printed out 3 years' worth of statements. He slid this thick manila envelope across the desk to me. I took it out to my car, parked way in the back of the lot, and tore it open. I fully expected to see dozens of tiny, desperate withdrawals. 500 here, 1,000 there. The kind of erratic stuff a gambling addict would do. But that is not at all what I found in there. Instead, there were only 3 massive withdrawals. 25,000, 20,000, and 30,000. I just stared at the dates and my heart started beating out of my chest. The first withdrawal was for $25,000. It happened on October 12th, exactly 2 years ago. I remembered that month vividly because it was the absolute lowest point of Clara's life. Clara had just checked herself into a highly restrictive 30-day inpatient wilderness rehab facility in Colorado. They had a strict blackout policy. No cell phones, no internet, and absolutely no contact with the outside world. There was physically no way she could have authorized a $25,000 wire transfer from a cabin in the woods. My heart started racing as I looked at the second date, April 4th. April 4th of last year was a Tuesday. Clara had been hospitalized with a ruptured appendix. She was in the ICU for 3 days, heavily medicated and barely conscious. She certainly wasn't wiring 20 grand to an offshore gambling ring. The dates didn't just fail to add up. They completely shattered her confession. If Clara didn't take it, who did? Only 2 people had access to the account details. Clara, who supposedly found them, and the custodian of the trust. My father. I sat there for a long time, just trying to think. October, 2 years ago. What was Dad doing? And then it hit me. The Westwood Project. The global supply chain crisis had hit, and he was terrified the project was going under. Then, suddenly in mid-October, he announced he'd secured a private, silent investor. The crisis was averted. The first withdrawal from my college fund was on October 12th. I looked at the second date. Last April, Dad was hit with a massive lawsuit. He settled it out of court quietly to avoid bad press. The second withdrawal was April 4th. The final withdrawal was the exact week he bought out his retiring business partner. The truth was sitting right in my lap. My father wasn't a victim. He was a thief. So my dad was a thief. He drained my future to save his own skin. But that still left one massive, agonizing question. Why did Clara confess? Why would she sit there sobbing and take the blame if she didn't do it? I didn't drive home. I drove straight to Clara's apartment building on the edge of town. It was this rundown, depressing complex. Total contrast to the sprawling suburban estate my dad lived in. I was done playing games. I banged on her door until she finally opened it. She looked completely exhausted, swallowed up in that oversized sweater of hers. The second she saw my face, she panicked. She actually tried to shut the door on me, but I wasn't leaving. I pushed my way right past her into the apartment. The place was dim and claustrophobic, and you could just feel how heavy her life was. She backed away from me, looking like a cornered animal. I just looked at her, keeping my voice eerily calm. I told her I went to the bank. Then I tossed the manila envelope right onto her cheap kitchen table. I wanted her to see the proof. Clara completely froze. She started stammering, telling me she already confessed and she didn't know why I was dragging this out. She kept saying she was a mess, begging me to just drop it. She was still trying to lie. I snapped at her to stop. I pulled out the first statement and pointed right at the date. October 12th, 2 years ago. 25 grand. I asked her point blank where she was on that exact day. She wouldn't even look at the paper. She just stared at the floor, chewing her nail, mumbling about being out of her mind gambling. I raised my voice. I told her she was in rehab in Colorado without a phone. Relentless, I pulled out the second sheet. April 4th. She was in the ICU with a ruptured appendix while I held her hand. I stepped closer and told her I knew Dad took it. I just asked her, why? Why let me hate you? Clara squeezed her eyes shut, and the tears finally spilled over. She couldn't hold the lie anymore. She collapsed into a kitchen chair, hiding her face in her hands. Through a ragged sob, she finally told me the truth. He made her do it. I pulled out the chair across from her and just sat there. The anger was still burning, but now I just needed the truth. I told her to tell me everything, right from the beginning. Over the next hour, the darkest secret of our family was finally dragged into the light. Clara told me that 2 weeks before my birthday, Dad showed up at her place. He was completely panicked because he knew I was about to get control of the trust. Dad had been paying Clara's rent for the last year, basically keeping her on a leash. He sat her down and admitted he took my money to save his business. But he couldn't put it back in time. He told Clara that I worshipped him, and the truth would destroy our relationship. Then he used her own struggles against her. He said, I already expected her to be a screw-up, so it would just be easier if she took the fall. He promised he'd slowly pay me back through her if she kept her mouth shut. But if she didn't, he threatened to cut her off completely. She would have been homeless. She literally didn't have a choice. I just sat there, staring at the sister I had spent my whole life judging. She wasn't the villain I thought she was. She was just a pawn. Dad weaponized her trauma just to save his own skin. The rage I felt right then wasn't hot or loud. It was just cold. Absolute clarity. My whole life, I thought I was the good one and she was the bad one. But it was all a lie. He was a parasite feeding off both of us. I stood up and looked right at her. I told her to pack a bag. She looked so confused, but I wasn't asking. I told her she was coming to stay with me, and she was done taking his money. He didn't control her anymore. When I said that, she just started crying harder. But this time, it was different. It was like years of suffocating weight just lifted off her shoulders. For the first time in our lives, that invisible wall Dad built between us was totally gone. We weren't the golden child and the screw-up anymore. We were just two sisters who finally figured out who the real enemy was. The next morning, I woke up with absolute clarity. I called my dad and told him I wanted to come by his office to talk about those student loans. He sounded so relieved, probably thinking I'd just accepted my fate. When I walked into his pristine, glass-walled office, he was sitting right where he always did. He stood up with this warm, comforting smile, playing the perfect dad. He even gestured to the leather chair across from him, acting like he was going to save the day. I didn't sit down. I just walked right up to his immaculate desk. I looked him dead in the eye, holding the envelope from the bank. I told him I didn't need a loan. I needed my money. I dropped the bank statements right in the middle of his perfect desk. It was all right there in black and white. Every single lie he told, sitting right in front of him. His smile slipped for a second, but he tried to keep up the act. He started using that soothing, condescending voice he always used. He told me we'd already talked about this, and that Clara had drained the account. I cut him off right there. I told him Clara was in a blackout rehab facility on October 12th. And she was in the ICU on April 4th. I told him she didn't wire those funds. He did. The silence in that room was suffocating. I watched the color completely drain from his face. For the first time in my life, I saw my dad totally panicked. The mask just fell right off. I didn't let him breathe. I leaned over the desk and listed every single one of his business emergencies. The Westwood project, the lawsuit, the buyout. I told him the dates matched perfectly. He used my future to cover up his failures. He didn't even try to deny it. He couldn't. He just slowly sank into his expensive leather chair. Sitting there in his huge, beautiful office, he looked so incredibly small. But of course, he couldn't just apologize. His shock turned right into defensive anger. He started making excuses, saying I didn't understand the pressure he was under. He actually tried to tell me he stole my money to protect us?
I wasn't gonna let him play the victim.
I told him he didn't care about us. He only cared about himself. He willingly destroyed my relationship with Clara just so he wouldn't have to look me in the eye and admit what he did. He actually bristled at the word thief. His ego just couldn't handle the truth.
He tried to tell me he was always going to put the money back.
But his excuses just sounded so hollow and pathetic now. I just looked at him with this cold, absolute clarity. I told him he stole my future and used my sister as a human shield. He was exactly what he always accused Clara of being. Say, dropping the hammer. He was a complete fraud.
That pushed him right over the edge.
He stood up, his face totally flushed with anger. He started shouting about how dare I speak to him that way after everything he'd done.
He tried to play the I am your father card.
I didn't even flinch. I just looked at him and said, not anymore. Then I reached into my bag. I pulled out a legal document I'd spent the entire morning drafting with a lawyer. I slid this legally binding promissory note right across his perfect mahogany desk. It outlined the exact amount he stole from the trust, plus all the interest. And it gave him exactly 30 days to pay it back in full. He actually scoffed at it, shaking his head like I was joking. He told me he didn't have 80 grand in liquid cash just sitting around. He said all his money was tied up in his properties. I told him he better sell one then, because if he didn't sign it right then and there, I was going straight to the police. Telling, I promised him every single one of his wealthy country club friends would read about his wire fraud in the papers. I watched his eyes go wide. I had finally found his ultimate weakness. It wasn't guilt, and it sure wasn't family. It was his precious reputation. He just stared at me and whispered that I wouldn't dare. I told him to try me. Let's see exactly how much that reputation is worth. He stared at the paper for a long, agonizing minute, his jaw clenched so tight. And then, with a shaking hand, he pulled out his pen and signed it. He shoved the paper back across the desk without saying a single word. I picked it up, checked his signature, and slid it into my bag. It was finally over. I turned toward the door and told him Clara was living with me now. I made it crystal clear that he was never to contact either of us again. Once that money cleared, we were done. As I grabbed the door handle, he called out to me. He told me I was making a massive mistake. He actually had the nerve to say that we still needed him. I looked back at him one last time, sitting there all alone in his beautiful empty office, surrounded by all his trophies. He just looked incredibly pathetic. I didn't even feel angry anymore. I just told him we never needed him. We just needed him to stop using us. And then I walked out. Stepping out of that building into the bright sunlight was the best feeling of my life. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, I could actually fill my lungs. The suffocating weight of his expectations was finally gone. It's been a year since that day. True to his fear of public ruin, my dad liquidated a property and wired the full amount 28 days later. I immediately moved it into an independent trust, completely out of his reach. I used the money to pay for my first year of architecture school, exactly like my grandfather wanted. I was finally building the future I had worked so hard for. Clara stayed with me for 6 months. Without the constant shadow of our father's judgment, she finally had the space to breathe. She got a steady job, started therapy, and eventually got her own place. Our relationship isn't perfect, and we have a lot of manufactured resentment to unlearn. But for the first time in our lives, it's real.
We're building a sisterhood based on truth, not on his toxic script.
I haven't spoken a single word to my dad since the day I walked out of his office. The silence between us is permanent now. And honestly, it's the most peaceful thing I've ever experienced.
I hear through the grapevine that he still plays the victim.
He sits around the country club with his wealthy friends, spinning this tragic story. He tells everyone his ungrateful daughters just abandoned him after everything he did. But his lies don't even bother me anymore. I know the actual truth. I know what he did in the dark to keep himself shining in the light. No amount of gossip can change what those bank statements proved. Sometimes the absolute hardest part of growing up isn't just realizing your parents are flawed. It's realizing that the roles you were assigned in your family were never about who you actually were. They were just tools used to keep you in line. I was supposed to be the golden child, the perfect daughter who never caused a problem. Clara was designated as the scapegoat, the perpetual screw-up. It made my dad look like this patient savior. We played those parts for years because we didn't know any better. I used to think my future was tied to my dad's approval. I thought if I played by the rules, I'd be safe. But that toxic system doesn't protect you. It just makes you an easier target. I lost my dad in the wreckage of his own lies, but I got my sister back in the process. I lost the illusion of a perfect family, but I gained my freedom. And honestly, I wouldn't trade that freedom for anything. Now I sit at my desk, looking over the blueprints for my final architecture project. The lines are clean, the measurements are exact, and the vision is entirely mine. I'm finally building something that belongs to me. Architecture has taught me a lot about life, but the most important lesson is about structural integrity. You can't build a beautiful house on top of a crumbling foundation. If you want to build something solid, you first have to clear away the rot. And that is exactly what I did. I cleared away the lies, the manipulation, and the toxic expectations. Now the ground is clear and the foundation is strong. The rest of my life is finally ready to be built. The blueprints for my final project were finally done. I rolled up those massive sheets of paper, and it just felt so satisfying. It wasn't just a school assignment anymore. It was proof that I survived the collapse of my family and built something of my own. Walking into the architecture studio that morning, I felt lighter than I had in years. That suffocating pressure from my dad's expectations? It was completely gone. I carried my project like a badge of honor, ready to show what I could do on my own. Standing in front of my professors, I presented my final model with absolute clarity. I didn't stumble over my words or second-guess my choices. I talked about structural integrity and clearing away weak foundations to build something strong. And honestly, I knew I was really talking about my own life. The model was this beautiful modern structure with a deep, unshakable base. It was the total opposite of the fragile house of cards my dad had built. My professors leaned in to look at the details. For the first time, I felt seen for my own hard work, not my family's money. While I was finishing my degree, Clara was building a new foundation of her own. She moved into a small, sunlit apartment across town. She looked so much healthier, and her eyes were finally bright. That heavy exhaustion that used to weigh her down was just gone. We started meeting up for coffee every Sunday morning. But this time, there were no tears and no devastating confessions. We just sat outside in the sun, talking about our hopes and our plans. It was such a simple routine, but to us, it felt like a miracle. Watching Clara laugh at a terrible joke I made, it hit me how much time we'd lost. We spent our whole childhoods thinking we were enemies, always competing for the approval of a man who only cared about himself. But sitting there together, I knew he hadn't broken us. After coffee, I walked back home, taking the long way through the city. The streets were bustling, and the buildings towered above me. But for the first time, I didn't feel small or intimidated. I had reclaimed my inheritance, my sister, and my right to choose my own path. I stopped for a moment and looked up at the sky, taking a deep breath. The whole Westwood betrayal was finally behind me. It was a dark chapter, but it forced me to open my eyes. I'm not the naive golden child anymore. I'm the architect of my own destiny. As I kept walking, the city skyline stretched out before me. It was full of endless possibilities, just waiting to be transformed. I cleared away the rot and laid down a foundation of truth. Now there's nothing left to do but build. The rest of my life is mine.